This Sunday, Holding Power, my exclusive interview with Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel as the island nation faces pressure from the Trump administration for a change in leadership. Do you think it is possible to get a deal with President Trump?
I think dialogue and deals with the U.S. government are possible, but they're difficult.
Would you be willing to step down if it meant saving Cuba? Plus, no deal.
The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement.
Talks between the U.S. and Iran collapse after 21 hours of high-stakes negotiations. Where does the conflict go from here? And allegations and denials. First Lady Melania Trump pushing back against claims linking her to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
I am not Epstein's victim.
As she calls on Congress to hold hearings for Epstein's survivors. And turmoil in the California governor's race. A former staff member accuses Congressman Eric Swalwell of sexual assault.
These allegations of sexual assault are flat false.
As top Democrats urge him to end his gubernatorial campaign. My guest this morning, Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida and Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington State. Joining me for insight and analysis are Telemundo news anchor Julio Vaqueiro, Amna Nawaz, co-anchor of PBS NewsHour, Republican strategist Matt Gorman, and former Biden White House senior advisor Steve Ricchetti. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history, this is Meet the Press with Kristen Welker.
Good Sunday morning. We are beginning with a world on edge, where the Trump doctrine of regime change is being tested. Vice President J.D. Vance in Pakistan Saturday for meetings with Iranian leaders, overnight announcing no deal had been reached to end the war, as the Trump administration works to keep that ceasefire from collapsing. But first, a new front in President Donald Trump's pressure campaign. After the fall of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro and the killing of Iran's supreme leader, President Trump is now warning Cuba could be next. This week, I traveled to Havana for the first U.S. television interview with Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel. It comes as Cuba is locked in an extraordinary standoff after the U.S. imposed an oil embargo in January, deepening the country's humanitarian and economic crisis that the U.S. says started 67 years ago by Cuba's communist government. I want to start with President Trump, because President Trump's threats to take over Cuba come as the United States has removed President Maduro from power, has invaded Iran and killed its supreme leader. Do you fear you could be killed or arrested by the United States?
That is a very interesting question. Those of us who have leadership positions in the revolution have a strong commitment to our revolution and to our heroic people. And in this connection, our responsibility entails the conviction and the commitment that we're willing to give our lives for the revolution and for the cause that we defend. So for me, that is not a matter of concern. If the time comes, I don't think there would be any justification for the United States to launch a military aggression against Cuba, or for the U.S. to undertake a surgical operation or the kidnapping of a president. If that happens, there'll be fighting and there'll be a struggle. And we'll defend ourselves. And if we need to die, we'll die, because as our national anthem says, dying for the homeland is to live.
What you're saying is very powerful. But are you afraid for yourself, for your family? Or are you prepared to, as you say, make the ultimate sacrifice if you are attacked?
I have no fear. I am willing to give my life for the revolution. Of course, I wouldn't like that to be the attitude of the U.S. government.
Is Cuba actively bracing for the possibility of a military attack by the United States?
Like I've always said in previous meetings and previous interviews, and when I also address the Cuban people, it is evident that there are threats out there. It is part of the rhetoric of the U.S. government. Cuba has done nothing to offend the U.S. Cuba has never said about attacking the United States or interfering with the United States affairs. However, you hear that Cuba is next, that Cuba is going to be next, that there's a way out, that they're going to take over Cuba. So, from the position of responsibility within the leadership of the country, that is a warning. And we need to responsibly protect our people, protect our project, and protect our country. So we are preparing ourselves for defense. But what is the concept of our preparation for defense? We have a doctrine which is entirely defensive. It is not aggressive. It doesn't pose a threat. In addition, we also believe that as we prepare ourselves to defend, is the best way to avoid war and the best way to preserve peace.
Let's discuss the situation here in Cuba. The people of Cuba are suffering right now. Your power grid has failed. Food and energy are running dangerously low, and these problems existed in some form before the blockade was put into effect. Do you take any responsibility for the pain Cubans are experiencing? Usted es el presidente. ¿No se siente responsable?
A ver, el pueblo cubano está sufriendo.
The Cuban people is suffering. And this can be seen in two areas, in the national aspect and also at the family level, because everything takes place on a daily basis. But what is the main cause for that suffering? Has it been the mistakes that I myself have made, or, like I said, a collective leadership? Or is that suffering, or the government, or is that suffering is the result of the policy of intensified blockade that the United States have maintained? I think that the people can provide that answer. So these are a number of restrictions which are not applied to any other country in the world. Therefore, we lack financing in order to buy food, to buy supplies for our main productions and services, in order to have the medicines that we need and to carry out the repairs that we need for our national energy system and our industrial factories. How does that reflect on our people now?
And yet the people of Cuba say you cannot solely blame the United States because you can trade with other countries. The economy has been in decline for the past 10 years. Hundreds of thousands of people have left Cuba over the past decade, many of them who are young entrepreneurs. Is that a sign that the Cuban economy and government has failed the people of Cuba, la gente de Cuba?
Te decía.
Like I said, when you see that at the family level, how does that happen? There is a scarcity of food, a scarcity of medicine. The nights become a very long working nights when you've been 20 hours with a power outage.
But this is before the blockade.
That's when you need
People
to do
were suffering before the blockade.
No, let me explain. There's a confusion in terms of the approach. For example, we were living under the blockade conditions, but the blockade was intensified and further tightened and became qualitatively different in the second half of 2019 with implementation of 240 measures and with Cuba's inclusion in the list of countries who supposedly sponsor terrorism. So everything became worsened. So we have the accumulated effects of the blockade plus the effect of the tightening of the blockade, and now the effects are caused by this energy blockade. And I can say this responsibly to you. This is not the fault of the Cuban government.
We saw it with our own eyes. Los vimos con nuestros ojos. People living in severe poverty, sufriendo in the streets of Havana, the capital city. Is it time for Cuba to take some responsibility, to look in the mirror and to change its economic system for the people of Cuba who are suffering here, que están sufriendo?
Nosotros siempre hacemos análisis muy autocríticos.
We conduct very self-critical analysis and assessment of our reality, and we're trying to constantly transform and change what we do in order to improve what we do. But that's got nothing to do with the political system. It is not our political system that is embracing that inability to move forward Our political system is serving people, is serving social justice and making everyone advance. And it seems that it bothers other people around the world because of what it represents, because it is our system for ourselves, not that we want to impose our system on anyone else. And they try to block it like this.
We understand that there are conversations between Cuba and the United States. Do you think it is possible to get a deal with President Trump?
I think we can have an approach in terms of what is possible and what is difficult. I think dialogue and deals with the U.S. government are possible, but they're difficult. Cuba has always stood by its commitments, and the United States have not fulfilled its part of the deal. In the present, the U.S. has been engaged in talks with other countries, and while these negotiations are not underway, they have attacked those countries, and all of this creates a lot of distrust. And we know that inside the United States, there are forces that whenever they see that there's a possibility to engage in discussions, to engage in a dialogue, they try to undercut and boycott those talks.
Are you talking directly to Secretary of State Marco Rubio? And do you trust him?
Nosotros estamos en conversaciones.
We have engaged in talks, and we will be in talks as long as the United States agrees to with the U.S. representative that they decide in order to have this relationship with us. But these talks are very complex processes. First, you have to establish a channel for dialogue. Then you need to build an agenda for the discussions,
But have you
including
spoken to
both,
Secretary
both
Rubio?
common interest.
Sí.
Yes?
I haven't spoken to Secretary Rubio. I don't know him.
Let's talk about some of the key demands the United States has. It includes releasing political prisoners, scheduling multi-party elections, and recognizing unions and a free press. Are you willing to commit to any of those conditions that the United States has laid out?
Bueno, en estos momentos no hay ninguna, nadie nos ha demandado esa.
Nobody has made those demands to us, and we have established that respect to our political system, our constitutional order, are issues that are not under negotiations with the United States, and we need to overcome, Kirsten.
So they're giving me the hard rap. So let me get these questions out. There are still more than 1,200 political prisoners, including one of the most high-profile political prisoners, Cuban rapper Michael Osorbo, who's been imprisoned since 2021 for writing a protest song that won 2 Latin Grammys. Will you commit to releasing him and the other political prisoners?
Este es otro de los temas en los cuales.
That's another issue in which you can see all of these bias and all of these prejudices. They speak about political prisoners in Cuba. Like you said, when the people is going through a very difficult situation, there are people in Cuba who are not in favor of the revolution. There are people who do not support the revolution. And they manifest themselves on a daily basis against the revolution, and they're not in prison. This narrative that has been created, that image that anyone who speaks against the revolution is thrown into jail, that's a big lie, that's a slander, and that's part of that construct in order to vilify and to engage a character assassination of the Cuban Revolution.
Would you be willing to step down if it meant saving Cuba? ¿Está dispuesto a dimitir con tal de salvar a Cuba, para la gente de Cuba?
A ver, tú que eres una periodista.
You are a very important and recognized journalist. Have you ever asked that question to any other president in the world?
Because it's one of the conditions the United States is asking for. Would you ever consider that?
Te explico.
Let me explain. Have you asked that question to any other president in the world? Have you asked that question to any other president in the world?
Yeah.
Could you ask that question to Trump?
Very hard questions of President Trump.
Eso muestra, ¿es una pregunta tuya o es una pregunta del departamento?
Is that a question from you, or is that coming from the State Department of the U.S.
My
government?
question is, because it's one of the things that we've heard the U.S. government talk about that they want political change here in Cuba. So my question for you, if they asked you, if they said this is one condition, would you say that?
Because of your honesty, I'm going to assume that you're asking that question because of those reasons. In Cuba, the people who are in leadership position is not elected by the U.S. government, and they don't have a mandate from the U.S. government. We have a free sovereign state, a free state. We have self-determination and independence, and we are not subjected to the designs of the United States. On the other hand, Cuban leaders are not here representing an elite of power. You can see my background, where I was born, my family, what I've done throughout my life. We are elected by the people, although there's a narrative trying to disregard that. Any one of us, before we become part of a leadership role, we need to be elected at the grassroots level in an electoral district by thousands of Cubans. And then those who represent the Cubans at the National Assembly of the People's Power elect those leadership positions and those offices like it happens in many other countries around the world. So we have an election system on the basis of people's participation. So whenever we take this responsibility position and this leadership position, is not out of our personal ambition or a corporate ambition or even a party ambition. We do that as a mandate by the people. And the concept of revolutionaries giving up and stepping down is not part of our vocabulary. If the Cuban people understand that I'm not fit for office, that I am not I have no reason to the occasion, then and I should not be holding this position of president, I will respond to them. But you need to realize that you should not focus only on the president of the country, because we have a collegiate leadership which is very closely linked to the people. But it's not the United States that can impose anything on us.
And you can watch my full interview with President Díaz-Canel on meetthepress.com. When we come back, Republican Congressman Byron Donalds joins me next. Welcome back. And joining me now is Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Congressman Donalds, welcome back to Meet the Press.
It's good to be back with you. Good morning.
It's wonderful to have you back. We are, of course, going to get to Iran in just a moment, but I want to first get your reaction to what you heard from the leader of Cuba. You have called the Cuban regime a state sponsor of terrorism that, quote, has to go. You just heard my conversation. Do you think that President Díaz-Canel is someone who the Trump administration can, in fact, make a deal with, or do you think there needs to be a wholesale change in leadership in Cuba?
I believe there needs to be full-scale regime change in Cuba. What you just heard was a dictator who wants to have the same deal as the Castro brothers, that he wants to be able to rule Cuba with an iron fist and die in office. That's what it sounds. That's what it sounded to me. I think what the American people need to understand is that Cuba for 67 years has been a communist dictatorship. They have suppressed the free speech of the Cuban people. The Cuban people today are rationing food. You talked about their power grid. Their economy's flat on their back. And I think for what Díaz-Canel was saying about how there don't have to be any changes for Cuba to be better is a lie. If you examine the history of governments around the world, free and open societies like America, that is where the people actually thrive and succeed and excel. In communist dictatorships or theocratic dictatorships where you suppress free speech, you actually don't hold open elections, you take away property, you take away property rights, what you find is that people do not thrive, they do not excel, they cannot build wealth, they can't build strong families. In essence, they can't have the American dream or that dream in any other part of the world. It starts with your political system, and when you have a dictator who wants to remain installed as opposed to letting the people of Cuba live free.
You heard President Díaz-Canel say that he is willing to die for his country. Let me ask you, Congressman, would you in fact support military action in Cuba if that were the way to lead to regime change?
I'm not going to stand and step in front of what the president and any decisions that he or Secretary Rubio are going to make on this front. But I think it's important for everybody to listen to his words. He would rather continue to suppress the people of Cuba to the point where they have to ration food, to the point where political opposition is jailed, where there is no free press, no ability to communicate. And he believes that that's worth dying for. I think that says all that needs to be said.
I want to turn to the other major foreign policy issue, Iran, of course, front and center. On Saturday, Vice President J.D. Vance held talks with the Iranians in Pakistan, but announced that no deal had been reached. This morning, really just moments ago, Congressman, President Trump posted on social media. I'll read you part of his post. He says, quote, "The United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz." How does blocking the Strait of Hormuz reopen it, which is what President Trump has said he wants to see happen?
Well, first, Kristen, let's establish something. Our Navy, its creation was actually to free international waters from the Barbary pirates. That's why we have a U.S. Navy. That's its creation and the history behind it. The president is trying to make the next strategic decision, in my view, which allows for them to have control over the straits and establish that control. I think in the president's comments, he also said that our men and women would go through the process of trying to find these mines that the Iranians dropped into the Strait of Hormuz and to decommission those mines and get them out of the way so that you could have an orderly return to the Strait of Hormuz being open. Last thing on this, be very clear. The Iranians have always been using the straits as economic terrorism against the West to protect their theocratic regime. I mean, we started with Cuba, now we're on Iran. What is the consistency here? You have dictatorships that threaten their people, that suppress speech, that jail political prisoners. Obviously, in Iran, we know there are no respect for human rights or for women's rights or for the rights of people who dissent. They just killed 40,000 people in the streets of Tehran, this regime. So the president is doing what's necessary to accomplish the main objectives here, and that has remained to make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon and to significantly degrade their ballistic missiles capabilities. The Iranians using the Strait of Hormuz against the rest of the world, the president, I believe, is doing the right thing, trying to control the straits, possibly in order to open that up for international water so you can have trade move freely, not just in that region, but for the rest of the world.
Let me drill down with you on the point that you raise about potential nuclear weapons. President Trump said last week that Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium is, quote, "so far underground, I don't care about that." From your perspective, Congressman, does any deal to end this war have to address Iran's nuclear program and effectively dismantle it?
I believe so. I think that's the core mission that the president has been talking about for quite some time. And it's not just over the last 40 days that we've been dealing with this. The president has been speaking about this for years. Number two, and for the American people, again, please understand, what the president is having to do now is to fix the foreign policy mess of several presidents when it's come to Iran. In his first term as president, through his sanctions, he had the Iranian government flat on their back. Joe Biden comes in, undoes all that. The Iranians were able to reconstitute their economy and as a result, begin the enrichment process again. So the president is trying to use every lever possible in order to bring this situation under control once and for all. A nuclear Iran is just simply unacceptable because that is a theocratic regime who is hell-bent on global jihad. They are hell-bent on spreading terror around the globe. That's been their modus operandi for 47 years.
Congressman, I want to move to some domestic issues now. Major headline this week, the First Lady, Melania Trump, put Jeffrey Epstein back in the headlines when she made a surprise announcement denying ties to the convicted sex offender. You're a member of the House Oversight Committee, which was scheduled to hear from former Attorney General Pam Bondi this coming Tuesday about her handling of the Epstein files. The Justice Department says Bondi's ouster excuses her from having to appear. Do you think Pam Bondi should testify this week?
Look, I don't actually at this point. I don't really think so. Now that she's a former Attorney General of the United States.
Well, Hillary Clinton. Hold on, Hillary Clinton wasn't in office and she testified.
Well, let me be very clear. We're going to be continuing with our investigations into this matter. The Oversight Committee has been steadfastly working on this, also with survivors who chose to come forward to bring more information. I think if a former AG Bondi comes in, that'll be a determination of the committee as a whole. Let me also say that the now former Attorney General, she did come into the committee in a session to have open conversation and dialogue with Republican and Democrat members. Republican members came, hold on, let me explain this is important. Republican members came to that committee hearing asking the former Attorney General Bondi, important questions. The Democrats refused to ask her any questions because they wanted the cameras on, because they wanted to turn it into a political circus. And I was in that room and disgusted, quite frankly, because you had members on the Democrat side of the aisle who had ample ability to question former AG Bondi, and they refused. Because the cameras weren't on.
Congressman, we're almost out of time, and I have two more questions for you. You actually voted to hold Bill and Hillary Clinton in criminal contempt earlier this year for failing to comply with a subpoena. Why shouldn't the same standard apply to the former Attorney General, Pam Bondi?
Well, like I said, we'll see what happens when we get back to D.C. If the committee still wants the former AG to come in, then I'm quite sure Pam Bondi will come in and you won't even get down that road. What happened with Bill and Hillary is that we had a bipartisan subpoena for them to come in, and the Clintons basically ignored the subpoena. So we had to move towards criminal contempt proceedings because Bill and Hillary were trying to negotiate their way out of actually coming in and answering questions.
All right, final question. I want to ask you about Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California, who's facing allegations of sexual assault and misconduct from former members of his staff, allegations he denies. One House Republican has filed a motion to expel Mr. Swalwell from Congress. On the other side, Democrats say they're going to respond with a motion to expel Republican Congressman Tony Gonzalez of Texas, who's being investigated for allegations of sexual misconduct. Will you vote to expel Congressman Swalwell, and will you vote to expel Congressman Gonzalez?
That vote comes to the floor, I will be voting yes on both measures. These allegations are despicable, and they demean the integrity of Congress. These things are just completely unacceptable. As far as I'm concerned, both gentlemen need to go home. All
right. Congressman Donalds, thank you so much for being here on a jam-packed morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
When we come back, Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal joins me next. Welcome back. And joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington. Congresswoman Jayapal, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you back. I do want to start on Cuba. You actually just came back from a 5-day congressional delegation in Cuba where you did meet with President Díaz-Canel. You heard him say in the interview that he effectively would not commit to the broad asks of the United States, including releasing political prisoners, committing to holding multi-party elections. Do you think Cuba needs to take those steps in order to move toward normalization with the United States?
Kristen, I think what is really important, and what he said to us, and what I heard him saying this morning as well on the interview, is that there need to be real negotiations. And that has been a frustration for Cuba, that there hasn't been a real negotiation with agenda items on the table for the United States and for Cuba. And I think there is a real desire for, appropriate desire for, America to respect Cuba's sovereignty. The embargo is the longest running embargo against any country in world history. The fuel blockade is just the latest part of that. But the humanitarian crisis on the ground and the collective punishment and cruelty towards the Cuban people, civilians, by the United States foreign policy is really outrageous. And I feel from my visit to Cuba that Americans would not want that to continue if they understood what was actually happening on the ground. And so that's why we were there for 5 days, to hear from all sides. We met with political dissidents. We met with the president, as you mentioned. We met with civil society organizations, religious leaders, entrepreneurs, people who see the opportunity for a real normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba.
Well, and Congresswoman, I wonder if you met with the political prisoners. There's still more than 1,200 of them. And in my conversation with President Díaz-Canel, he would not commit to releasing any of them. You have obviously talked about this. You just said you met with a number of people. Do you believe Cuba needs to release its 1,200 political prisoners in order for negotiations to move forward effectively?
I do, and this has been something that I've raised directly with the president, both this time and 2 years ago when I was in Cuba. I think that was the last time there were any members of Congress there. I think I've been the last person to visit Cuba twice in the last 2 years. Last time I actually met with the families of political prisoners. We took a list in to the president, and I think that what I have heard from the Cuban government is, let's put all these items on the table. He did just announce that they were releasing 2,000 prisoners. Not all of those are political prisoners, but we understand that some of them are. And I think that this is the kind of thing that we should push for in an actual country-to-country negotiation, not a dialogue, but a negotiation with actual items on the agenda. That's how we're going to move forward, is through that kind of diplomacy, not through, an economic bombing of the infrastructure of Cuba that hurts just everyday civilians and inflicts a level of cruelty onto the Cuban people.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's a lot of skepticism about whether any of those 2,000 were political prisoners at all. Very quickly, do you believe President Díaz-Canel is the best person to lead Cuba, or do you agree with the Trump administration that there needs to be an overhaul in Cuban leadership?
I don't think it is for the United States to determine who leads another country. I don't think we would like that here in the United States, and I don't think that it's appropriate for us to dismiss the sovereignty of civilians in other countries to choose their leaders. And so I think the way we get to a true democratic future for Cuba with dignity and freedom is by those negotiations, and ultimately by the ability for the Cuban people to thrive and for freedom to reign across Cuba. That's not through blockading a drop of oil from reaching an island, through bombing the economic infrastructure of the island, and through maximalist foreign policy pressures threatening military intervention. It's through negotiation and diplomacy. That's how we get there.
Congresswoman, let's talk about Iran now. As you know, Vice President J.D. Vance announcing no deal after marathon talks with Iran in Pakistan. Do you support these negotiations as a way to bring an end to this war? Do you think that is the best way to bring an end to it?
I do, Kristen, absolutely support negotiations. Let's remember that it was Donald Trump who took us out of and negotiated nuclear arms deal with Iran that was negotiated by President Obama in 2015. Donald Trump removed us from that in 2018. And that is what has led us to the place that we're in. Those negotiations took over 2 years. I don't think that in this situation that we were necessarily going to get to an agreement again with a day of negotiations. I feel good that perhaps there's still a path for these negotiations, but we should be clear. Donald Trump got us into this mess. He went into a war with Iran that was unauthorized and illegal. And because of that, we are in the mess that we're in now. There was no strategy, no plan, no authorization. We are now spending about $1 to $2 billion a day on this war with Iran. And it is a huge cost for the American people with rising energy prices, but also a lack of focus on the domestic issues that really drive people's lives. He's saying we don't have money for childcare, we don't have money for housing because we're at war with Iran. That was a war of choice. That is a war of choice. And we should never have been in this position to start with. This is an absolute outrage that this is what the Trump administration has gotten us into. And I don't think it's good for the people of the United States or for the civilians in Iran, in Lebanon, across the Middle East.
I do want to ask you about your colleague, Congressman Eric Swalwell. You heard me discussing this with Congressman Donalds. He's facing allegations of sexual assault from a former staff member, which we should say Swalwell says are completely false and politically motivated. Notable, though, House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries, Senator Adam Schiff, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi are calling for Swalwell to end his run for California governor. Do you think that Swalwell should drop out of the gubernatorial race?
I absolutely do. This is, as you know, I've been very vocal on behalf of survivors of the Epstein scandal. And I think that what we are seeing now is an emergence of women across the country who have been dismissed, told to shut up, told to move on, who have been abused by men in powerful positions. This is not a partisan issue. This cuts across party line, and it is a depravity of the way that women have been treated. And I'm just inspired by the courage and the bravery of the women who came forward. This is clearly a pattern. I've already called for Congressman Swalwell to drop out of the gubernatorial race, and I think we have to hold everybody accountable.
Do you think, you just heard Congressman Donald say he would vote to expel Eric Swalwell. Will you vote to expel Eric Swalwell?
And Congressman Gonzalez, I would. I've already said that I think that these things, charges and allegations and the pattern of abuse, and in Congressman Gonzalez's case, he actually admitted to the affair with the, or to, harassment with his staffer. This is also important for staffers across the Capitol to see that their bosses don't get to do this to them. So I do think that both of them need to step down from Congress, let these investigations happen. But I think that this is very important, that we believe women and that we show people across the Capitol and across the country that we will not accept this kind of behavior.
Very quickly, before I let you go, former Vice President Kamala Harris joined several other Democratic leaders at the Al Sharpton convention this week. She was asked a question about whether she was going to run again in 2028. She said, quote, "I'm thinking about it." Do you think former Vice President Kamala Harris should run for president again in 2028? Is she the strongest person to represent Democrats?
I think we should have a big contested primary, and everyone that thinks that they have an opportunity to really represent and show leadership for this country as president should run and should make their case, and the people should look very carefully at every single candidate. But it should be a happy, big, exciting attempt for us to be able to really see who has what it takes to lead our party forward. That's what we need, bold leadership, and I'm looking forward to a primary that demonstrates that from lots of candidates.
All right, well, it's only 2026, but in some ways it's right around the corner. Congresswoman Jayapal, thank you so much for being here this Sunday. We really appreciate it. When we come back, the last Cuban leader to appear on this program 67 years ago this month. Our Meet the Press Minute is next. Welcome back. The last Cuban leader to appear on this broadcast was Fidel Castro 67 years ago this month. He had just seized power in Cuba after overthrowing U.S.-backed strongman Fulgencio Batista. Castro was asked a question that would define his revolution, whether he sided more with communism or democracy.
I am not communism. I am not agree with communism. My acts prove free press in Cuba. There is no doubt for me between democracy and communism. But not only democracy as a word. That is why we call our ideals humanism, because we not only want to give freedoms to the people, but to give the way of getting their life, to eat, to live. not only theoretical words.
And when we come back, former Vice President Kamala Harris says she's thinking about running for president again. The panel is next. Welcome back. The panel is here. Anchor of Noticias Telemundo, Julio Vaqueiro. Amna Nawaz, co-anchor of PBS NewsHour. Steve Ricchetti, former advisor to President Biden. And Matt Gorman, Republican strategist and our newest NBC News contributor. Welcome to all of you. Matt, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Steve, welcome. Great to have you here on the panel. Thank you all for being here on a big Sunday. Julio, I want to start with you and what we heard from the Cuban president. I was struck by a couple of things, his defiance and the fact that he didn't commit to making any changes to holding multi-party elections, to releasing political prisoners, which is one of the top issues. What were your takeaways?
Totally. He was very defiant, but I wasn't surprised by that, to be honest, because that has been the Cuban government's position since the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. What is he going to say? Of course, he's going to say he's not going anywhere, but Nicolás Maduro was saying the same thing, and he's now in New York. So what I was surprised by is by him, the fact that he said that he's not in conversations with Secretary Marco Rubio, because we do know for a fact that those conversations are taking place. It's been reported that they've been talking to the Castro family, specifically Raúl Castro's grandson. So the fact that Miguel Díaz-Canel is not in those conversations puts him in a very vulnerable position. I've spoken to people who are close to the Cuban government, people who are against the Cuban government, people in the island, and they all agree on one point. Removing Díaz-Canel would only be a symbolic change, not a real transformation. And transformation is really needed, because at the end, this is a moral issue. In the middle of everything, you have the Cuban people, on the one side with an American government putting a lot of pressure because they decided they want change, a Cuban government that's been unable to create a sustainable economy. And the question is, for how long can you squeeze this population before anything changes?
Yeah, just being there on the ground, the despair in the eyes of the people there. And you're right, because what we hear from Marco Rubio is a call for wholesale change. Amna, let me turn to you, because another point that he makes was about these negotiations, that there's a lack of trust because they saw negotiations with Venezuela, with Iran, and then all of a sudden the bombing started. And here we have Vice President J.D. Vance saying, we didn't get a deal, and effectively saying there wasn't that trust that was formed. How do you think Cuba is watching what's happening in Iran right now?
I mean, clearly they're watching very carefully, right? President Díaz-Canel made that clear to you. And there are historical parallels. These are nations with 50, 60, 70-year regimes that pay very close attention to history, right? These are both nations where President Trump left deals that his predecessor brokered previously and has been unable to make new deals, even while ramping up pressure on both Iran and on Cuba, war being launched in Iran as well. The other parallel is, of course, as you mentioned, is what the even Iranian foreign minister mentioned to me days after the war there was started, which was it was a bitter experience talking to the Americans. Multiple rounds of talks that led nowhere, and then the U.S. and Israel launched their attacks. And that word mistrust was one we heard from the Iranian negotiators just after this last round of talks failed as well. But to understand Iran and Cuba, I think you have to understand Venezuela, as Julio mentioned, which is the president believed a limited special forces strike there to remove Maduro in a matter of days could be reiterated in other places. And Iran has proven that is not true. We hear from President Díaz-Canel saying Cuba is not Iran and it's not Venezuela.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk about the implications of all of this politically, Matt, because here is Vice President J.D. Vance leading these talks to try to bring the war to an end. What are the potential implications for any political aspirations he may have beyond being vice president in 2028?
Sure. I mean, you talk to his people. Yeah, you talk to his people, and it's not a fait accompli that he runs in 2028. It's likely, certainly, but it's not this automatic thing. What they've also said, and they've said this since he got elected, that the best way to position himself for 2028 is to do the job he was elected to well. There are no shortcuts in that. I thought it was notable, even though they might have disagreed privately, Trump and Vance on Iran, according to reports, it was a vote of confidence and a sign of trust to send him over there on behalf of Trump and the government to handle these negotiations. And I think you contrast that a little bit with who he could be running against in 2028. Kamala Harris, she was given a broad portfolio from a president who didn't exactly trust her. She couldn't define the portfolio. She didn't execute on it, and it became a liability. Those Vance folks are very aware of that comparison.
Okay, you take me perfectly to my question for Steve. Steve, this is what Vice President Kamala Harris had to say about potentially running in 2028 this week.
Are you going to run again in 28?
Listen, I might. I'm thinking about it.
Steve, historically speaking, can candidates who've suffered a loss like she lost in 2024 have a comeback?
The answer is yes, and I know she is seriously thinking about this. I am certain that she's looking at it. I think we can take her at her word that she hasn't made up her mind officially or finally yet, but I'm sure she's taking a look at it, and she should. She'd be a very strong contender if she decides to run. I will say this, and I noticed at the National Action Network that there were another 8 or 10 potential Democratic presidential candidates who also were interviewed by Reverend Sharpton. So many of them appeared, and I think every one of the potential candidates is laser focused really for the next 6 months on the midterm elections and Democrats winning back control in the House and Senate. When we ran in 2019, when President Biden ran in 2019, there were 24 candidates by June of 2019. So I expect a very large field for the Democratic primary and for the race. But again, there's a lot of work to be done between now and the midterms, and that's where the focus is going to be first.
Well, Matt, how do you think Republicans are viewing this answer by the vice president in the very crowded field that's gearing up?
Unabashed delight. I mean, we would love nothing more than to run again against Kamala Harris. And look, and that was also the strategy among Vance, too. If you remember the debate, he was not running against Tim Walz on the other podium. He was running against Kamala Harris. He was very smart in that.
Julio, do you think that there's an appetite for this type of a comeback?
I don't know. It's a hard one. I think we'll have to wait and see. It's still too early, 2 years before 2028. I will say this. I talked to James Talarico this week, and he's been able to make a lot of noise in Texas. He was very open about the mistakes that Democrats made in 2024 and how they took many voters for granted, specifically Latino voters, which I asked him about. And I mean, whoever runs, if it's Vice President Harris or whoever it is, they will have a lot of work to do to regain those voters.
Amna, the work begins in the midterms, but Julio's right. That's going to be the key question.
100%. And affordability and the economy remain the top issue for voters year after year after year. We know which way that's trending, but also let's get through the midterms first.
Steve, how are Democrats feeling heading into the midterms? How bullish, particularly when you have what's happening with Congressman Swalwell sort of overshadowing?
I do think that Democrats are very positive about the potential for winning back the House and the Senate right now. And obviously there was inflation data that was presented this week at, I think, 3.4%, a rise in the cost of living. And I think exactly what you said is going to be the focus of the midterm election.
All right, guys, fantastic conversation. Thank you so very much. Thank you for a great panel discussion. That is all for today. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.